Associate Professor of Anthropology at Dakota State University. First, I want to say thank you for the invite. It's always nice to get a little bit more connected to other archaeologists in the region. We sometimes feel a little isolated up there in Fargo. Of course, Fargo is not where most of my work has happened. So today I'm going to be talking about life, healthcare, and death on a colonial coffee plantation in Jamaica. And I'm just going to warn you that I tend to read a little bit, otherwise I go off on tangents and we never actually get to the point that I want to make. Okay, so I began working at the site of Marshall's Pen, a colonial coffee plantation located in Jamaica in the summer of 2012. At the time, I was an advanced graduate student looking to get more experience in the Caribbean, in part because my advisor was known for his work in Utah, and I was a budding Caribbeanist. So Dr. James, aka Jim Dell, who was not my advisor, was then a professor at Kristen University in Pennsylvania, working in a small department without graduate students. Now, he needed help running his field school, and I had done some work with him previously in Jamaica and also in upstate New York. And so when he invited me down to Jamaica, I jumped at the opportunity. Since then, since 2012, I've continued to work with Jim at the site, and over time took on the role of co-PI of this project. So over the years, we've been able to bring students from Kutztown University, which is where he was housed a while ago, and North Dakota State University, where I'm at now. And we've also had students from the University of the West Indies, Mona, which is the Kingston campus of UWI. We've had them all out to the site to participate in a number of field schools. More recently, Jim's moved into an administrative role, and I've started to move on to other projects, some of them local to Fargo, and some of them in other pieces. So it's been a little, we haven't touched some of this data for a while. So this talk has been nice for me because it's allowed me to sort of revisit some of the stuff. We do intend to publish on, we've already published a bunch, but we intend to publish on the stuff that I will talk to you about at the very end of the talk. So it's been nice to kind of have an excuse to come back to this research. Now, this evening I'm going to give you an overview of the work that we've done at Marshall's Pen. In particular, I'm going to summarize our fieldwork and findings in regards to architectural variety, village life, death and burial, and I'll end with a rather preliminary look at our most recent focus, the estate hospital. Hopefully, you'll leave with a sense of how data from the documentary and archaeological records have intersected in meaningful ways, thus allowing for a more complete understanding of this colonial coffee plantation. To start though, let me first provide a brief overview of Marshall's Pen itself within the context of colonial Jamaica. So what you're seeing is actually the backside of the grape house at Marshall's Pen. You'll also see these areas right here. These are barbecues where the coffee itself would have been processed after going through a wet milling process. Okay. Although Jamaica's plantation economy had been dominated by sugar since the end of the 17th century, in the opening years of the 19th century, the colony experienced a boom in plantation-based coffee production. Record high prices for coffee, brought on by the collapse of coffee production in the French colony of Saint-Domingue in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, encouraged investors, both large and small, to acquire and improve coffee lands in Jamaica's largely undeveloped interior. As the 18th century drew to a close, the mountains of eastern and central Jamaica were teeming with hundreds of developing coffee plantations. Not wanting to miss an opportunity to gain from such a promising enterprise, the outgoing governor, Alexander Lindsay, shown here, the 6th Earl of Belcaris, eagerly invested in vast coffee properties, leaving the island in 1801 to become one of Jamaica's wealthiest absentee coffee planters. In fact, it was not uncommon for plantation owners to live back in Europe and manage their holdings from afar. The Earl actually had more local knowledge than some of these absentee owners, which likely served him well after he left the island. An energetic businessman, the Earl remained closely involved in the management of his estates through an extensive and detailed correspondence with his agents or attorneys in Jamaica. The correspondence, in its near entirety, has been preserved at the National Library of Scotland as part of a collection of family papers known as the Crawford Minutes, and has proven to be an unequal source of information about the social and economic world history. One of the exciting aspects of historical archaeology is this triangulation that occurs between multiple data sets, including the documentary record. So we often will get a lot of great information from the documents, we get a lot of great information from the archaeology, the material culture. Sometimes these things align, and sometimes they don't. And when they don't, that's the really fun part, right? To figure out what's going on, why we're seeing some contradictions there. Marshall's Pen, a property located in what is now the parish of Manchester, formerly the parish of St. Elizabeth, was acquired by the Earl as part of his attempt to increase the acreage he could put under productive cultivation. And you see it highlighted there, it's sort of in the south-central part of the island. And I will just point out that Jamaica is one of the Greater Antilles. It's a relatively large island in the Caribbean archipelago, and it has some pretty significant mountain chains, which is important for coffee production. All right, so back to the Earl. His estates, known as Martin Hill and Balcarres Plantation, were acquired as going concerns. But Marshall's Pen was purchased by the Earl as a largely undeveloped amount of land. I should also note that it was common for the wealthiest of plantation owners to hold multiple estates. In 1812, 40 acres of old-growth forest was cleared for the first coffee production on what was then called Douglas Run, eventually renamed Marshall's Pen. Now, the first, quote, Negro houses were constructed on the site in that same year. And you can see those in the map up here, right? So this is Marshall's Pen, where you have the house structures and the barbecues. If you were to follow this road up, it comes up here, and this is where the village is. Okay. So the first, quote, Negro houses were constructed on the site in 1812. It would appear that this initial site preparation was completed by laborers from Martin's Hill. Remember, that's one of the Earl's other plantation sites, which is not terribly far away. But it wasn't until 1814 that a gang of enslaved laborers was purchased for the Earl by his Jamaican attorneys and situated in the newly erected, quote, Negro houses at Marshall's Pen. In 1815, Marshall's Pen had the best prospect for coffee production of any of the Earl's properties. During these early years, the enslaved population at Marshall's Pen was quite isolated, being managed by men who lived at least 3 hours walk away through undisturbed forest. Although there were already 70 acres in coffee on the site by 1815, the Jamaica attorneys felt it necessary to recommend that an overseer's house be constructed closer to the, quote, important settlement of Marshall's Pen. It was not until 1819, however, that a bookkeeper was assigned to the estate. The records indicate that Martin's Hill remained the center of operation for the Earl's St. Elizabeth's estates, with a single overseer, Adam White, managing both plantations. White was an infrequent visitor to Marshall's Pen, and the initial development of the plantation went on with a little daily supervision by white estate staff, which might run counter to what we typically think of when we think of colonial plantations. Alexander Lindsay died in March of 1825, at which time his son and heir, James Lindsay, James Lindsay is the older gentleman in this picture, so towards the end of his life. James Lindsay, the son of the Earl of Balcarres, later the 24th Earl of Crawford, took over the proprietorship of the Jamaican estates. Of course, I don't think he ever set foot on Jamaica. He held on to these estates through the transition away from slavery until he reached a point where they were no longer producing revenue sufficient to cover the costs of operation in the early 1850s. Okay, this brings me finally to the archaeology. Archaeology at Marshall's Pen has taken place in 2 phases. Jim, my collaborator, began working at the site in the late 1990s with a team of students from Franklin and Marshall, a small school in Pennsylvania. With his focus being drawn to other areas, he sort of hit pause on this project in the early 2000s, I think around 2001, and had not returned for almost a decade by the time we arrived there together in 2012. Our last field season came in 2016, when I took a group from NDSU down to the site. Unfortunately, the pandemic has prevented a lot of us from getting back into the field for a while. Early excavations focused on the enslaved labor village. During this phase of the project, a few house areas were excavated, and the field crew also focused on mapping the extant ruins, as represented by this map. We continued to focus on the village in the second phase, but we also extended our research into areas beyond its stone fencing. It's this archaeological work to which I'm now going to turn. Unlike the linear rows of houses shown on a historic map, so remember this is our historic map right here, and you can see that the houses are represented in these really nice, neat rows. That's not what the village actually looked like, right? The village at Marshall's Pen was characterized by a number of different house areas separated by stone fencing. Animal pens were also present in the village. On this map, made in the first phase of work, you can see the house foundations or stone platforms represented by rectangular boxes. As you're about to see in the photographs to come, these foundations were not necessarily perfectly rectangular stone foundations. Obviously, this map is a representation of our on-ground interpretations. I'll be focusing on the architectural features as well as the material culture associated with 3 different house areas over here. House areas 1 and 6 were excavated in the early days of the project, and house area 2 was excavated during phase 2. I'm going to start with house area 1. Now, as you can see from the pictures, the excavations focused on the remnants of the stone platform of the house structure and the surrounding areas. So it might be a little difficult to see, right, but this is actually a stone foundation. I promise when you're on the ground, it actually looks like more of a foundation. We're on a little bit of a slope there, so they're actually leveling out areas with these stones. We also have a lot of erosion because this area was turned into pasture land for cattle, but also, as I'll come to discuss, a lot of these foundations did have cut limestone that was later robbed for other construction purposes once the village was abandoned. Okay. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but one of the notable things recovered from this area were chunks of plaster and what's called Spanish wall. Importantly, there were also relatively few nails found at this house site. Given the architectural materials recovered, this leads us to believe that house area 1 would have been built in a manner similar to this structure. Jim took this photograph some time ago in a small town called Chorus. So we know that there are still extant buildings made using this construction technique, which involves plaster and stones along with some wood framing. I'm not exactly sure why they call this Spanish wall house or Spanish wall technique. Perhaps it dates back to the Spanish colonization of Jamaica, which predated the English. But this is still a building variety that you'll see around the island. You'll notice the photo in the bottom right hand corner of the slide is actually a larger stone recovered from house area 1 that displays that red plaster. So we're pretty confident that house 1 would have been built in the Spanish wall technique. Leaving house area 1, we'll now move on to house area 6. So here's another view of the map just to orient you. House area 1 was directly above 6. Like house area 1, house area 6 was excavated after the first phase of excavations at Marshall's Pen. Students found a wealth of materials at this structure, but the important thing to note is that they found an abundance of nails. I mean, a lot of nails. This is just a sample of those nails. Unlike house area 1, Spanish wall and plaster were not found while excavating. Based on this material evidence, we're led to believe that the structure would have been built in a manner similar to the board house pictured here. Nails obviously played a crucial role in this type of construction, and I'm blanking on where this picture is from, but also from a small town in Jamaica, in the area of Manchester. Interestingly, house area 6's assemblage consisted primarily of domestic servingware, so things like bowls, plates, saucers, fragments of iron cooking pots, and the remnants of a bottle dump that consisted of fragments of dark green wine bottles, case bottles, and stoneware jugs. When we floated soil from an associated burned earth feature, we recovered the remains of several medicinal plants and common beans. Small artifacts, including several glass beads, were also recovered from this feature, as were fragments of iron spoons, forks, and cooking pots. The evidence suggests that this central area of house area 6 was a locus of social interaction and maybe even functioned as a grog shop. This brings us to house area 2, which you can see again on the map here. 2 structures in this area have been excavated during the second phase of work, the two buildings that are furthest to the left there. House area 2.1 was a particularly large building with some notable architectural features. It appears to have 2 internal walls, a plaster floor, and a veranda off to one end. Now, you might be able to make out 2 depressions within the foundation, so right here and right here. We believe these features to be post holes for structural support for interior walls, which was pretty uncommon amongst slave cabins at this time, slaveholders. Over on the left, you can see the carved limestone that would have allowed space for posts supporting a veranda off the end of the building. So hopefully we can get a sense of that sort of rounded cut into the limestone. Along this edge here, you cannot see it in this image, but there are actually 3 of these cuts where they're standing, and they're standing at the end of the structure over there. The slope is going down from them. So we believe that these would have provided, these posts would have provided some structural support for something of a veranda going off of this house. So this is a pretty unusual house for an enslaved labor village. It's pretty notable, right? We have also excavated another house within the same area, house 2.2. This structure was smaller in size, but also contained a plaster floor, which you can see in this picture, right? So that sort of smooth surface right here is actually what I'm looking at excavating right there. So a very delicate feature. At the time, though, it would have not been as delicate, right? People would have been walking around all the time. This portion of the floor was much more intact than anything we saw in previous houses. In one corner of the house, you may also notice another stone feature, which I tried to highlight here. It's a little hard to see, but you can see there's sort of a rectangular stone feature in the corner of the house there. We believe this to be the remnants of a chimney base. At just over 2,000 feet above sea level, it would not have been uncomfortable on most evenings to have an interior fire in Jamaica, right, which might surprise some people. Working in the mountains in Jamaica is great because it doesn't get quite as hot as it does on the coast. However, the size of this feature, which was about 4 by 4 feet, it may indicate an oven. And if that's the case, this structure may have been used as a bakehouse. The population received rations of wheat flour, and while they could have been making dumplings in iron cooking pots, more refined bread products could have been baked for sale in house area too. As an aside, a noteworthy feature of colonial Jamaica is that the enslaved laborers at one point actually held more currency than the estate owners. And this is due to their robust local markets where they sold food that they had produced in their provision gardens as well as other foodstuffs that were cooked and baked. So an oven used to bake bread for sale is not an unreasonable interpretation here. I will point out that even though the enslaved labor population may have held more currency, the owners still had the majority of the wealth on the island. It's just that most of their wealth was tied up in the estates, the land, the buildings, but also in the people that they owned. Okay. House Area 2.2 also contained an elaborately terraced garden feature that came to the side of the hill and was bounded at the edges by stone fencing. A small animal pen was also tied into the stone fencing, and at the bottom of the garden was an above-ground tomb. House-yard burials are still common in rural parts of Jamaica to this day. Overall, in House Area 2, we see more elaborate architectural features, perhaps speaking to the social standing or technical abilities of the individuals who lived in this area. It may have even been a space reserved for a dragon. So why does any of this matter? Well, for starters, we're gaining a more complete understanding of the Marshall's Pen village. Unlike some estates where the neat linear roads pictured on the maps accurately represented the village, you do see this. At Marshall's Pen, we know that wasn't the case. The layout of the Marshall's Pen village into house compounds that varied in size and architectural design and features speaks to the relative degree of autonomy this enslaved community had. Absentee planters, the transfer of the estate from the elder to the younger earl, turnover in estate managers, changing business plans based on the volatile coffee market, movement of laborers between estates, due in part to then the slave trade, and the more remote and often treacherous landscape of the upland location all led to a greater freedom in establishing the socio-spatial dimensions of the village. The tremendous range of house sizes, construction techniques, and yard sizes and features present at the Marshall's Pen village may well be evidence of the status differences within the enslaved community. Finally, these 3 house areas have also revealed differences between activity areas that speak to economic activities that tie this population to the larger system of internal trade in Jamaica. The potential bakehouse, the communal cooking feature, the terrace garden, animal pens, and a possible grog shop are the infrastructure enslaved people would have needed to produce and exchange goods. This village was a site where people lived, socialized, and produced what they needed to sustain themselves. But it was also a site where they engaged in economic production that extended beyond the plantation's primary function of growing coffee. When we talk about enslaved villages, I think we often have this mental image of just a place where enslaved laborers went to spend the night. But this was truly a village. There was a lot of activity taking place here. If you're interested in reading more about this variation within the village, Jim and I do have a book chapter on it, and I'm happy to send out electronic copies. No need to buy the book. Okay, now on to the cemetery. One of the extraordinary features still extant at Marshall's Pen is a cemetery that is seemingly associated with the original slave village. The village lies up a hill to the northeast of the cemetery, which is in something of a low-lying valley. Enclosed by a low stone wall, it's home to 27 identifiable tombs made from cut limestone. An additional stone-filled depression has tentatively been identified as a potential mass grave for victims of a post-emancipation epidemic, I believe it was cholera, though we remain uncertain about that. The burials in the cemetery are all oriented to the east so that the tombs are illuminated by the rising sun. As I'll discuss later, the documentary record offers some insight as to the dating of the cemetery. Now, when we first arrived at Marshall's Pen in the summer of 2012, the cemetery was overgrown and needed to be cleared. On the left of this screen are images of students clearing the site of vegetation. You can see a tomb prior to being cleared of the overgrowth. Right? It might be a little hard to make out, but this is actually an above ground tomb right here. You're going to see that again in a minute, and it will be a little bit more obvious that it is in fact a tomb. As you can see in the bottom right hand of the image, the low stone walls encircling the cemetery were covered by debris being removed from the stone. So this is all stuff. These are stone walls. You can't see them, they're underneath the debris. But this area was heavily overgrown. There was some initial clearing before we got there, and we continued to clear it. But we actually weren't expecting to work on the cemetery. As a testament to the power of Mother Nature, by the time of our last visit in 2016, the cemetery was virtually unreachable due to the overgrowth that had taken over. I mean, we're talking about growth up to my chest. We could not easily get into the cemetery by that point. So 4 years later, right? The pasture surrounding the cemetery has not been as actively used for grazing purposes in the recent years, and the cemetery has really all but disappeared from the landscape. If you were to walk through the site now, you would not know that it was there. As I mentioned earlier, the tombs were made of cut limestone, and some of them had obviously been quite large. As I mentioned, we had not initially planned on working in the cemetery, but given the aggressive growth of vegetation in the area, we found it pretty important to record it in greater detail when the opportunity presented itself in 2012. As you can see here, some of the tombs were only represented by a slim outline at the surface level. Many of the tombs showed evidence of tumble and erosion, which was likely caused by natural site formation processes once that superstructure of the tombs had been removed. But a handful of the tombs still had a significant amount of superstructure still in place. So it's a little hard to see, but this is actually the outline of a tomb there. So this one had really been robbed. But you do get a sense of some of the cut limestone here. All right, here's an example for you, tomb 3. Remember that tomb that I showed you before and I said there is in fact a tomb there? This is it. So once we uncovered it, we can really get a much better sense of the cut limestone blocks there. Out of the 27 tombs in the cemetery, tomb 3 was the only one to really fully escape having the cut stone superstructure removed. This particular tomb also still has segments of red mud plaster adhered to it, so that sort of red coloring that you see on the stones themselves, we believe that the entire tomb would have been covered with that at one point in time. This red mud plaster was then shaped to create a vaulted effect. It's unfortunately impossible to say whether this tomb was singularly built this way or if all of the tombs were treated in this manner. The vaulting would have been destroyed when the cemetery was mined for that cut limestone. Interestingly, I visited a site in Trelawney, which is in the north of the island, in 2017, and came upon some burials with similar tomb structures. We've also seen very similar tomb structures in Manchester near Marshall's Pen. So this seems to be a relatively common form, but we don't know if it was the exact form that all of the tombs had within our cemetery. Most of the tombs seem to contain singular burials, given their dimensions. 3 tombs, however, are particularly large and may entomb several individuals. One explanation for tombs 17 and 27 may be the interment of a married couple. Tomb 26 appears to be a composite burial with 3 distinctly sized tombs abutting each other and decreasing in size from 1.7 meters in length to 1.25 meters to just under 1 meter in length. So it's possible that this represents the grave of a family group. We do see some variation in the mode of burial within the cemetery, and that's what this represents. Although no tombs have been excavated, the sidewall of one has been exposed to several feet below the surface by the falling of a large tree. It's a little difficult to see in the images, but several courses of cut limestone actually extend below the ground surface, suggesting that the tombs are likely constructed over a deeper interment. Thus, the tombs serve to both enclose the body underground and to create a substantial marker above ground. These relatively elaborate tombs, especially given the cemetery's association with the enslaved labor village at Marshall's Pen. However, we know that in Jamaica, grave markers have become more and more elaborate over time. So what do we know about death and burial at Marshall's Pen? Well, in 2014, Jim and I published an article in Slavery and Abolition that provides a more detailed view of death at this estate than I can give today. In this article, the causes of death for workers at Marshall's Pen are explored via the documentary record, most of which are what you would expect on a colonial plantation, and include things like yawns, which is a highly communicable disease, consumption, but also injury. Moving beyond just the cause of death, evidence gleaned from the Crawford correspondence indicates that the cemetery at Marshall's Pen was enclosed in 1836 and likely remained in use until the 1850s. The correspondence between the Earl and his on-island attorneys shows that a plan was laid out and then later confirmation was sent of enclosing the cemetery with a stone wall. The correspondence seems to suggest that the purpose of the enclosure of the cemetery was that as full emancipation grew closer, it would be important to inculcate a connection and loyalty within the workers to the entire estate rather than particular house yards, and a generalized cemetery would serve a central role in such a process, right? Having a place to visit the ancestors is a very important thing within Jamaican culture. In Jamaica, full emancipation came in 1838, but an apprenticeship system began in 1834 that really began a rather slow transition to full emancipation. Based on later correspondence, we know that house-yard burials were not uncommon at Marshall's Pen before and even after emancipation. This also speaks to the role that the enclosed cemetery would play in creating a more generalized attachment to the estate, rather than specific house yards among the workers. The documents, when combined with archaeological evidence, paints a more complete picture. Now, a geophysical survey conducted in 1998 revealed several rows of linear anomalies outside of the walls of the graveyard, consistent with burial shafts. It thus seems possible that the new burial ground was constructed adjacent to one in use during slavery, but that between 1836, when the burial ground was enclosed, and 1853, when coffee production ceased and the estate was sold, the dead were entombed in an enclosed graveyard. It would appear that, as was the case at other Jamaican plantations, the workers at Marshall's Pen had a simultaneous tradition of cemetery and house-yard burials. Okay, and so you can see the cemetery that we recorded, but then these are those likely burials that would have predated the enclosed cemetery. At a minimum, our work in the Marshall's Pen cemetery has recorded what remains of the 1836 to 1850 cemetery. As we all know, recording and preserving information is an important feature of archaeological work. Taking things a step further, these findings highlight the variation within mortuary practices of enslaved Afro-Caribbeans. It's possible that burial patterns differed between colonies, between regions of the same island, and perhaps even between neighboring states. Of course, this recognition of variation also helps to confirm the fact that enslaved people exercised a fair amount of autonomy over the interment of their dead, a conclusion espoused by archaeologists for quite some time. Okay, I'm going to finally turn to the focus of our last principle at Marshall's Pen, the estate hospital. I'll also mention that we're still working on formalizing these findings, so there's nothing that can print about these. and I'm happy to receive feedback and comments, especially on this work. You'll see in the bottom left-hand corner of this map an outline of the structure we're currently discussing. I'll begin with a quick overview of what we found in the documents. Now, during the last decade of slavery, the younger Earl worked through his agents to do what he could to make Marshall's Pen a productive and profitable operation. Amongst the changes that occurred under his proprietorship was the creation of a hospital on the estate. On September 4th, 1826, the estate attorneys wrote to the Earl, quote, "At Marshall's Pen, the estate's tradesmen have erected an excellent hospital on my income, a building very much needed. This has not cost the property anything beyond a trifling outlay for nails and hinges, paint, and glass for the windows," end quote. The estate's accounts, as forwarded to the Earl, suggested the hospital was nearly complete, as the following was purchased apparently for the construction of the building. And so you can see up there just some transcribed records. You see a lot of panes of glass. The second and third lines, that DO just stands for ditto, right? So more panes of glass and a bunch of hinges. The structure was clearly of significant size and importance to the estate. In an October 1829 letter defending their management of Marshall's Pen to the Earl, the attorneys had categorized the hospital as one of the primary buildings on the site. And quoting again, "There are only 4 roofs on the place, viz. The overseer's house, under which was the mill, where now stores will be, the bookkeeper's rooms, which just contained them, the hospital, the large store for copy, a small house of 2 rooms, and an office have been erected for the pen and for the bookkeeper." In September 1831, George Brooks, who briefly succeeded the Atkinsons as the attorney for Marshall's Pen, wrote to the Earl concerning the condition of the property when he took over its management. In his letter, he alluded both to the generally poor health of the population and by extension the capacity of the hospital that had been built in 1826. Quote, "The Negroes at Marshall's Pen have been laid up with ulcers, etc., but I am glad to say by the attention of the medical gentleman and the overseer, they are recovering fast. When I took charge, there were 65 in the hospital. Chronic disease seemed to grip Marshall's Pen in the final years of slavery." 3 years later, Marshall's Pen's final attorney, Duncan Robertson, wrote to the Earl that he and his partner, quote, "have to observe the many chronic cases on this property on our taking charge, every attention having been paid by the medical attendants and overseer to the sick in the hospital," end quote. Based on the documentary record, it seems that Marshall's Pen's hospital was not only a substantial presence on the landscape, but it was also an active site from the get-go. Regardless of the commentary on costs presented by the attorneys, the investment in the structure in terms of labor and cost would not have been inconsequential, especially during a period of uncertainty and transition for Jamaica's plantations. You'll recall that emancipation in Jamaica dates to 1838, but again, remember the process starts in 1834. So while the hospital does not appear on any known maps at the site, a substantial foundation located near the estate cemetery seems to correspond to the scale of the building as described in the documents. The other more noteworthy structures mentioned earlier, that overseer's house, the bookkeeper's room, the copy store room, these have all been located. We know where these structures are, leaving the hospital as really the viable option in regards to this particular sizable foundation. And it's a little hard to see the scale of it, right? But it's pretty extensive there, and you can see by the human bodies, right? But we're talking a very large structure. In the summer of 2016, we began excavations in and around this large structure. An important feature to note, this foundation would have originally been faced with cut limestone blocks that have since been removed. So much like the tombs in the cemetery, a lot of the superstructure supporting this foundation was gone by the time we got there. And this is consistent with other structures, not just the tombs. Over the course of 2.5 weeks, field school students from NDSU excavated 29 units and each double test pits. They found approximately 1,300 artifacts, and we also mapped the foundation. I wish I had very pretty finalized maps to show you, but they're not quite ready, so you're just going to have to trust me when I say that this foundation was, in fact, large. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the assemblage recovered largely resembles that of other structures already excavated within the enslaved labor village. In regards to ceramic finds, we find a nice sample of undecorated decorated pearl room, transfer print, and cord and herringbone, among others. You see the cord and herringbone up there, that's the pretty blue stuff. We also see numerous examples of mocha slipwares, and so these are interesting type fairly significant amount of pipe stems, some of which were rather long, and at least one that still had a large portion of the bowl attached to it. Now, the glass we recovered included the typical dark green bottle glass. This is ubiquitous across colonial sites. In fact, we often just shorten it to DGDG, dark green bottle glass in our notes, so we don't have to write it all the time. But we also uncovered a fair amount of window glass, as well as a few unusual pieces that I'll show you in just a minute. Iron finds were not uncommon and largely came in the way of nails, but also cooking pot pieces and handles, a horseshoe, and barrel strap fragments. So at a bird's eye view, this assemblage looks quite similar to those associated with other houses on the site, with maybe the exception of the window glass. We did have a few noteworthy finds that may speak to the medical function of the structure. First and foremost, the wider than normal finish from a light green bottle may represent the medicine bottles found in doctor's kits, although we haven't been able to confirm this quite yet. Well, its shape is rather unusual, and the size and color relative to the typical glass bottles that we find in contemporaneous context at Marshall's Pen has intrigued us, right? It's kind of grabbed our attention when it comes to this particular artifact. Additionally, this oblong metal piece may represent the internal handle to an instrument of some sort. In fact, if anybody has an idea of what this might be, please let me know, because we're still trying to determine what it is. Other noteworthy finds that may not necessarily speak to the function of the building, but that still set the structure apart from others associated with the enslaved laborers, include a blue glass bead and two glass stemware vases. Right, so it's a little hard to tell, but you can see the rounded nature of this. That is the base of, like a wine glass, right? Some stemware. Population, or to ritualized events associated with health, birth, or death. Of course, we also might just be witnessing the imperfect nature of archaeological sampling in action. Now, a true comparison with the foundation in statistics, perhaps, needs to be conducted between the assemblage recovered from the hospital and those associated with other structures on the site, particularly in the village. Yet, upon first blush, the material culture associated with this foundation appears to be just a little different in terms of representation of certain types of artifacts. To start, there seemed to be a higher percentage of mocha slipwares, pipe fragments, and window glass. We're seeing a lot more of this associated with the hospital. Additionally, virtually no coarse earthenwares or stonewares were recovered at the slopes. In other words, we did not find much in the way of utilitarian ceramics, which have been ubiquitous at other sites, other areas within our site. As you can probably tell, we're still in the early phases of working through the documentary and archaeological data, and yet we're increasingly confident that this structure is in fact the hospital described by the Earl's attorneys.